Hello, everyone. We are live with another episode of Level Up Law, where every Tuesday at noon, South Carolina Legal Services is leveling up your legal knowledge on an area of law that we practice in. I'm Susan Engel, Senior Staff Attorney here in our Greenville office of South Carolina Legal Services. We welcome you in, and with me, as always, producer Kenneth Elliott in the background. Thanks for being here. And before we get started, I do want to let you know, if you didn't already, that this episode is about the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, really important federal law that gives protections and rights to our citizens. So we'll be talking about that today. And I do want to, as always, remind you that this is not legal advice, just general information for the public. Hopefully it is useful to you going forward. And if it is, and you find the presentation today to be helpful, we always do ask that you share it out with folks if you're watching live, or if you are watching the replay on our YouTube channel, where Kenneth will post this recording of this episode pretty quickly, usually same day or the next day. So we always appreciate that. But if you're watching the replay, please do click like if you like it. And always while you're there, if you haven't subscribed to our YouTube channel, please do so. We've got a lot of great information there, but also we always have new information coming your way that maybe you haven't seen before. And today's topic, I think, is probably one of those. So let's get started. You will see on your screen here a QR code that we always provide for you to scan if you'd like to get our email newsletter. So just scan that QR code and it'll take you to a spot where you can sign up. Also, another QR code, and we'll give that newsletter QR code again at the end of today's presentation if you missed that. But now this QR code is a way for you to suggest a topic for one of our episodes. So we always appreciate that. If you can let us know what you want to hear about in the world of law, because if it's not something that we do, it certainly is probably something that one of our colleagues in the private bar does, or maybe a topic that one of our partners can provide some information on. So definitely let us know. Scan that QR code and send in your ideas. Okay, today we're going to talk about the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. So we'll talk about the act in general, but also some thoughts about looking at equal credit opportunity through a racial lens. You know, this is Black History Month, and we want to definitely highlight some of the issues that we see when it comes to how race and other protected groups will be affected when it comes to a particular law. Today, it's the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. So what is it? What's the Equal Credit Opportunity Act? It's been around for a long time. It prohibits credit discrimination on the basis of sex, race, marital status, religion, national origin, age, or even receipt of public assistance. It's something to think about. So if that information is asked for, sometimes it's okay to ask for the information. You shouldn't always require that information, but certainly it can be asked. But it can't be used to discriminate against you when a company is deciding whether or not to grant you credit. Okay, so, and we'll talk some more about the different ways that that can happen. But this is going to protect you from dealing with companies that are regularly extending credit. That can be anything from banks, auto title loan, payday lenders, department stores. There's all kinds of ways that you can apply for credit. It might be a credit card. It might be a loan. It might be, buying a car and getting the financing for that. It even applies to mortgage lending. So And who is covered by it? Well, any company in person who participates in granting credit, participating in the granting of credit, and that can be people who are just helping to arrange financing and even the advertising of that financing. All of those have to follow this law. And also, I think this is important for those of you who might have a small business. It does protect small businesses as well. So that's important to know. We'll talk about that just a little bit today. So here's the code section where this law is located, 15 U.S.C. section 1691. And Regulation B is the implementing regulation. So it gives all the details that you'll be hearing about today. So under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, you can't be denied credit based on these factors that I've already mentioned. And the public assistance, I think, is an important one because you do have the right to have reliable public assistance considered in the same manner as other income. And so sometimes you may run into a company that you're seeking credit from that say, oh, well, we can't use public assistance as a factor. But actually they can, and they can't discriminate against you because your regular source of income is from some kind of public assistance. So definitely keep that in mind. Anytime you're denied credit, remember you do have the right to know why it was denied. And so typically that's going to come in the mail after the fact. Sometimes they'll tell you, but the typical requirement is that you get that in writing after the credit has been denied. And one thing to point out there is when the credit has been denied, and if they do tell you why, and they ask for some other source of credit or income, like a spouse or other family member or something of that nature, someone of a different sex, then if they ask for that and say, well, that will help you actually get approved for the credit, that's a violation of this act. So those are the kind of things that we need to keep in mind when we're applying for credit. So it does apply very broadly. Not every Consumer Protection Act does apply broadly, but this one certainly does. It prohibits discrimination in any aspect of a credit transaction. So when you apply for credit, if you've already applied for credit and actually received it, there may still be things that are involved in the whole credit part of the transaction that is still going on, and that can be affected by your rights under ECOA. We'll talk about some more details on the aspects of credit transactions, just to kind of give you a laundry list of what those might be. Now, you need to keep in mind, sometimes companies will characterize the financing in a certain way. They might try to call it a lease, they might try to call it something else. But it's important to know that how a company characterizes the financial product, or maybe even the benefits that that product is supposed to be providing to you, just because they don't call it a credit application or a credit transaction doesn't mean that the Equal Credit Opportunity Act doesn't apply, okay? Because the facts and the circumstances of every situation are different, and they may be a credit transaction under the Act, and so it's important for you to realize that just because the company says, oh, no, this isn't credit, we're not using your credit, they may still be doing that, and the ECOA will apply. So there are two important things to note when it comes to discrimination. As always, this is true with every situation, not just under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. You have disparate treatment and you have disparate impacts, okay? Treatment is just going to be when a creditor actually uses a prohibitive factor in making a credit decision about your application. So when a creditor uses factors that are not necessarily prohibited or improper, but they still have a negative or disparate impact on a protected group, disparate treatment. Disparate impact. So those are the two different things. Disparate treatment is probably it's the easier one to understand, and but it's rare. Well, I shouldn't say rare. It's less often that you see disparate treatment being very clear, right? Having direct evidence to prove that a creditor is specifically treating applicants in a way that is prohibited under the Act. It's more often that we see disparate impact. In other words, there's factors in the credit application that may not violate the Act, but it's the effect of those that makes it discriminatory. There are those times, and this is an exception you see on the screen here, that creditors can sometimes take into account something that is a prohibited factor under the Act, but that really has to be when it's a special purpose. So, you're trying to increase access to credit, for a special group of people or under a special grant, perhaps. So that's typically going to be a government grant or a program with a nonprofit that's maybe trying to increase opportunity for a special group that's being discriminated against when it comes to credit and lending. We see a lot more of that today than we really ever have. So that is not going to be any kind of violation typically of the Act. So let's talk about disparate treatment first of all. Okay, so how do you show that? There's two ways to show discrimination from the standpoint of the law. You have direct evidence, and then you have circumstantial evidence. So as you'll see here, direct evidence, which clearly will establish what we call a prima facie case. These are things like the creditor admits that they use a factor that's not permitted under the Act. Like, okay, it's clear that they've admitted that they use race, for example, as a factor when they are deciding if someone qualifies or is eligible for credit with them. Don't see that very often, but it does happen. Statements that are made, and that can include obviously racial slurs or remarks by the lending agent, the person who you are dealing with when you're making that credit application. But keep in mind, there has to be shown a connection to a statement or remark like that and the adverse action or the declining to give you the credit. Another way to have direct evidence is testimony of former employees. Sometimes employees have maybe left a business because of this kind of impermissible treatment. And if you can find one of those employees that will testify that in fact that was used as a factor, then that would be direct evidence of disparate treatment. Another way you can, this is not a limit, this is not the only way you can have direct evidence, just some examples. You might get some documentation from the company that you applied for the credit with, and there may be some notes in their records that show that they have used an impermissible factor. So if they wrote on your file, declined because they are Native American, that's pretty clear, right? So that can be direct evidence that proves a violation of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, because you're not giving an equal opportunity to that Native American because of their race. Now, how about if it's just circumstantial evidence? That's a little bit tougher than having something that's direct. So circumstantial evidence, you can only prove the prima facie case with showing that, okay, you're a member of a protected class, like you're Asian, for example, that's your race. You've applied for credit that you do qualify for. You got to show that. And then you got to show that you were rejected for credit despite being qualified for that credit, just like everybody else. And then you have to show really that the company has continued to approve credit for people who have the same qualifications as you do, but they're not a member of that protected class that you're in. So in that example, you're Asian, and only Asian people, for example, are being declined, right? Everybody else with the same qualifications is getting the credit. All right, so let's talk about disparate impact. That's not when you're treated disparately, but you're treated in a way that the impact of it violates the act. So, so you might find a company that you're applying for credit with, and they have a particular practice or policy. It turns out it seems like it's neutral, but it causes an adverse or disproportionate impact on applicants of a particular type. And here's some of the racial groups that you might find in the way that I was just describing: Black, Latino, Asian, Native American, other communities of color. Again, it's not just your race, it can be other things, but this is an area where we see this a lot. So if you're showing, or you're able to show, that a particular practice that they use, and we'll talk about a couple of examples in a minute, if you show that it does have an adverse impact, then they have the right to show, well, yeah, that does have perhaps an adverse impact, but we have a legitimate business need for that policy, and we can't meet that with any less of a discriminatory impact. Now, it's hard to think of what that might be, but that is a way out for the creditor if they can show that. Okay, so let's talk about the 4 basic standards for the disparate impact. Okay, it's a practice that doesn't appear to discriminate on a prohibited basis, as I was just saying, but it can still be prohibited if it has the disparate impact on a prohibited basis. Okay, so to be able to do something about it, that's what we call actionable, to be able to file a lawsuit, it has to be disproportionately negative. That impact has to be disproportionately negative. So if it's more negative than it is positive for what the creditor is trying to do, then it might be actionable. And that's just a balancing act. Do they have a justification for it? And does that the higher level than the other? And also, it's important to know this. A creditor might say, well, we didn't mean for that to be discriminatory. And their lack of intent is irrelevant. It's irrelevant to the decision-making process on that. So I think that's an important point to know. And I also wanted to mention, for those of you who might be an entrepreneur, small business owner, this does apply to small businesses as well. So there might be some financing products that are deceptively advertised to you as a small business. Oh, do this type of financing for small businesses, and it helps you in this way. It could apply to businesses through unfair billing and debt collection practices as well. So here's just some examples of that, so you'll know what I'm talking about. It could be false claims regarding what is necessary to get the financing. So for example, they might say, oh, well, you're going to need 2 pieces of collateral, like 2 pieces of property, or you need a piece of real property, but you also need stocks and bonds as collateral, something like that. But it turns out that they don't require that of all small business. And they're just requiring that of you because of protected, you're in a protected. And we see this sometimes continuing to charge the business after they've already paid. Okay, well, here's these extra charges. Even though you've paid off the loan, we're still charging you some certain kinds of credit fees. Also, a big one is deceptive marketing of the financing products that they're selling and that you're applying for. A lot of companies will try to hook you in by saying that they, only cater to small businesses and entrepreneurs or something like that. So it makes you think, this is for me. This is going to help my business in some particular way that the company is marketing. Unfairly using things like confessions of judgment, debt collection threats, unauthorized withdrawals from your bank account. Most often in today's consumer marketplace, it seems like you're always required to pay a loan, or often, I should say, required to pay a loan by having an automatic withdrawal from your bank account. I've seen many cases where the company just withdrew unauthorized amounts. So they might say, oh, there was this, there was a late fee, or there was a fee to check your credit report after you already got the loan. There's any number of ways that they can say you owe something else besides your regular payment. And they've got that access to your bank account. You've probably signed an agreement that says that they can withdraw for other amounts that become due and owing under the loan. That's why it's always important to read the terms and conditions so you know what they're going to be able to do. And then you wonder, well, gee, why are they able to do that? Well, it's because you gave them permission in the contract. So you got to watch out for these kinds of things. They might want you to, or ask you to, sign a confession of judgment before you even fail to pay the loan. Okay, a confession of judgment is where you say, oh, okay, I owe the money, haven't been able to pay it, so you can have a judgment against me without having to go to court and sue me. You don't want to sign something like that before you ever get the loan that you've applied for. But if they're requiring you to do that, that's an unfair practice. Things like misrepresenting savings and fees. A big one has been, of course, during COVID and really after that, misleading claims about the relation of a loan and your ability to qualify for it based on COVID issues. And also keep in mind, if you're a small business, sometimes that discrimination has to do with not necessarily your company, but maybe one or more of your business partners, officers, and things like that. And it may also have to do with who your constituents are, who your customers are. Obviously, it can also have to do with other companies that you associate with or affiliate with. So if you're an entrepreneur, a small business, look for all of this, because it's not just about you. It can also be about others that you associate with or do business with. Okay, these are just a little bit of a list of certain aspects of a credit transaction that you may find is discriminatory in your particular situation. So, we've talked about marketing of credit, how they're advertising it to you and what they're saying it will do, the application process, how you apply, and what information you're required to give can be discriminatory under the Act. How they evaluate you. They may, and you wouldn't realize this would be something that you'd have to discover, but they may have different evaluation processes for white people as opposed to black people. That's something that is a violation of the Act, and you have to be aware of that. And just keep a close eye on what you're doing and what the creditor is doing where you're applying credit. Obviously, the terms of the credit. So if you're Asian and you are required to pay a higher interest rate than someone who is not Asian, maybe is white, that's a violation of the Act if it's just because you are Asian. Credit reporting, loan servicing, debt collection, all those remedies that creditors have. There's any number of ways that these violations can just kind of sneak into the whole process. So, we talk about a racial lens. You really got to keep an eye out. You need to, first of all, just know what your rights are, but also realize that despite the fact that progress may have been made in this regard, it is still very rampant, the violations of this Act. So be vigilant. Okay. So why the need for a racial lens when it comes to the Equal Credit Opportunity Act? And let me first say, this is not the only area where we want to apply a racial lens, right? There are many areas in the law and otherwise where we need to think about these things. And I think COVID has been an eye-opener in a way, because it has revealed, as far as being somewhat of an economic crisis, that does weigh heavily on people of color, because unfortunately in our society it's still the case that quite often people of color, people in poverty, are paying more for less in our marketplace. It's just a fact, and we see it every day here at South Carolina Legal Services. So that shows that for people of color, there's a lack of access to traditional financial institutions, and that certainly is true. And also, there is targeting by the high-cost lenders of these protected groups, certainly the racial groups and others. And it's not just a race that's protected under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. All of those other groups are protected. But today we're really talking about the racial lens, so I'm just kind of focusing on that. But you have payday lenders, auto title lenders, these small dollar lenders who require household goods as collateral. They charge those high rates of interest, and they are, studies have certainly shown, studies by the government have shown that in neighborhoods where mostly are communities of color, that's where most of those payday lenders and other title lenders and finance companies are more heavily located, because that's who they're targeting. So we need to be aware of that, and you as a consumer need to be aware that you may have to find a way to step out of your neighborhood and to go and get that traditional financing to rise above what's being done by some of these lenders. And finally, I think we've already said this, but discrimination does still exist in the marketplace, and so to to survive economic crisis, financial hardship, things happening like COVID that changed the whole landscape when it comes to our finances. We need to really keep in mind that we do have rights, and where you can find access to exercising those rights. And one of those is the Equal Credit Opportunity. Okay, and just to close out, I wanted to give you an example, talking about the racial lens and all that. And weblining, you've heard of, obviously we talked about targeting, you've heard of redlining. Weblining is a phrase that has been used more recently because of the internet. And I think it's really important to realize that this is a big area where the Equal Credit Opportunity Act can have an effect. So there is a study, and probably more than one, but this one was by the U.S. Department of Commerce, that showed that there was less access and use of the internet by certain protected groups. It might be lack of financial ability for access. It might be the location that you're in where the access is not there or not good access. And so when companies limit, and many of them do now, there's a lot of situations where you have to have the internet to be able to apply for a particular kind of loan, to file something with a government agency. Usually there's always that ability to do it in writing or do it by the phone, but that ability or that type of access is not always highlighted on websites. Sometimes it's hard to find the street address on a company on their website. It's hard to find a telephone number to call them because everything is focused on that efficiency of everything being online and going through that internet link. So, so think about this. When a creditor offers internet-only deal or a special discount if you are applying for the loan on the internet, who's that excluding? People who don't have internet access or have very limited internet access, or just don't have the ability or wherewithal to use the access that maybe they have. And so what you're doing is affecting those people by not giving them that same deal. Now, if you're giving the same deal to folks who don't have that internet access or that ability to tap into that special internet deal or that special discount, if you're giving the same to both, that's probably not going to be discriminatory. But if it's only for people who apply online, and it's a significant difference maybe in the interest rate or the amount of a loan that you can apply for, and there's a difference if you do it through the internet, that could be a violation of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, because you're not giving that same opportunity to people who don't have internet access. And if you're talking about, especially a lot of rural areas here in South Carolina still don't have that really good internet access. And if you are a household that of poverty where you can't afford that internet access, can't afford that equipment to access the internet that's out there, that's going to be a problem for you, and you're going to be potentially discriminated against not having that same opportunity. Now, I know we think about that, well, everybody's got a cell phone, and I think probably a decent majority of people today do have cell phones. Not all of them have the ability to use the data part of their cell phone where they can access financing or anything else through the internet, or they may just not even be able to use that part easily, and that's a factor in this. Redlining has been challenged under Regulation B. That's the implementing regulation for the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. And Regulation B does prohibit advertising that discourages prospective applicants on a prohibited basis. So you are discouraging people who don't have access to the internet, and that may have that negative impact on communities of color. So just a really, I think, important and current example of what we're talking about with how or credit can be impacted. And when we start to look at what's going on with things like credit, and we use that racial lens to kind of dig a little deeper, not just on the surface, but dig a little deeper, then sometimes we're going to see things like this and other things that I've mentioned today. And those can definitely violate that act, and you do have rights under the act to hold companies responsible and sue for damages and things like that. But that is a presentation for another day, how to do that. So think about this. It is Black History Month, and that's why we are trying here at South Carolina Legal Services to highlight some of the things that can happen when it comes to race and the laws that we represent people with our cases on. So I'm glad I've been able to bring this to you today. And thank you for being here. I don't know if we have any questions. I'll check in just a moment. But I do want to also mention our next episode of Level Up Law, because although it is Black History Month, next week, February 14th, which is Valentine's Day, we have a special presentation coming from our partners at the FBI, and that is a episode that is coordinated and co-sponsored by our partnership here with the South Carolina WEAD Task Force, which is a group of, I think, probably 20 agencies, whether it be government, private, nonprofit, who are gathering to promote helping the elderly, prevention of abuse of the elderly, both physical, mental, and financial. And so that co-sponsorship is focused on Valentine's Day. We have two gentlemen from the FBI who will be talking about romance scams, very relevant for Valentine's Day. So definitely sign up for that. Stay tuned for a great presentation by the FBI next week. And I do want to thank all of you in the audience for joining us today or joining us on the replay. If you have any issues under this law or any others that we handle cases in, please do check it out. Here's our contact information. We have a toll-free number that you can call Monday through Thursday, 9 to 6. We've got great intake specialists. They're standing by to take your call. If you can't do it during those hours or you're having trouble getting through, sometimes those lines can get jammed up with people needing help. You can always apply online. Our website is here on your screen. And also, just remember, we have all kinds of resources that can help you on different legal issues that you may have. We have a website here. We have our YouTube channel where you'll find Level Up Law episodes and other videos that can be really helpful. Obviously, we have social media, so like, subscribe, follow, do all that stuff, and you'll see what we have coming up, not just on Level Up Law, but on other things. You can see what we're doing, where we're going to be with a clinic or an outreach event. So definitely sign up for those. And while you're signing up, you can scan that QR code and sign up for our newsletter. So definitely do that. We'll see you next week. Appreciate you being here today. Thanks to producer Kenneth Elliott back there making sure everything's going right. Before I sign off, I am going to look really quick, see if we have any questions. And I must have just given a lot of good information because I don't see any questions. But if you have any questions or comments, when we post this to YouTube, you can definitely feel free to post those there. Check it out. Like, subscribe, sign up for those notifications so you'll know every time we post an episode of Level Up Law. Thanks for being with us today. That concludes today's Level Up Law episode.